to the 4th episode of my exotic tier list, the series where I review every exotic weapon in Destiny 2 in the order they are listed in the Exotic Collection Volume 1 book from the Bungie store. A link to the full playlist is in the description. In this episode we are reviewing the Void Pulse Rifle Graviton Lance, and as with the previous 3 episodes, we will be slapping it onto the tier list at the end of the video. For many years Graviton Lance was the only 2-round burst pulse rifle in Destiny 2, but that all changed when the final ship got released, as since then there's been a few heavy burst pulse rifles that have been added into the game, which we'll be using to compare Graviton Lance to later on in the video. Graviton Lance is a rather interesting and fun weapon based just off of the lore and the perks that it has. The exotic perk is Black Hole, which says the second shot of a burst rips a hole through space-time, doing high damage and recoil with no fall-off, which just means that the 2-round burst, the first shot does regular damage more or less, and the second shot does a lot more damage, but causes the weapon to kick a lot more. That second shot is immune to any sort of range or anything like that, so no damage fall off, which is quite powerful, especially in the likes of Crucible, which of course I don't play. The trait cosmology also says the kills with this weapon cause enemy targets to detonate and spawn void projectiles that track targets. Now this is the more PvE orientated trait in my opinion, which means that if you defeat an ad, for example, just a regular red bar enemy, it'll spawn a void projectile, go and kill some other enemies, and it can really clear out hordes of enemies very, very quickly and efficiently. Those 2 perks certainly make Graviton Lance a very interesting weapon, and it definitely earns its exotic title based upon that. The first thing we can look at is the damage increase on that second shot. So in the firing range in the Enclave, the first shot does 1278 damage, and the second shot does 1728 damage, which is a 35.2% increase on the second shot, which is rather substantial. From my experience with Graviton Lance, it is definitely very, very useful in PvE. As I say, the void projectile spawning upon defeating an enemy is great for clearing out smaller enemies, and it even does pretty decent damage to stronger enemies, so it definitely earns its place in PvE, and from what I see in Crucible as well, it's very useful because of that second shot having the no drop off range, and the catalyst as well, which I don't really go on to in this video because I don't care about range really, does also increase the range, and that's very useful in Crucible as well. All around, very much an exotic weapon. The 2 legendary 2-round burst pulse rifles that we will be comparing Graviton Lance to are Aish'a's Care and Corrasion. Both of these came out this year after the final shape. Aish'a's Care is a Trials of Osiris weapon, and Corrasion came out during episode Echoes. As you will see from the testing, both of these weapons are virtually identical. Corrasion is arc, whereas Aish'a's Care is strand. Corrasion has 2 extra shots in the mag, which leads to 1 extra burst. However, Aish'a's Care also pairs with some strand effects very nicely, and for that reason I do prefer Aish'a's Care, which I'll get onto in a wee bit. Both legendary pulse rifles do the exact same damage, a base damage of 1339, which is a 4.7% increase over Graviton Lance's first shot. However, the second shot is a 22.5% decrease, which is rather substantial. Precision damage is a very similar story. The legendary weapons do 3051 precision damage, with a 4.81% increase over Graviton Lance's first shot, but a 22.54% decrease over Graviton Lance's second shot. When calculating the total damage of the burst, we actually find that the 2 legendary weapons do 10.92% less damage than 1 burst from Graviton Lance, which I don't think is a small amount. Despite all 3 pulse rifles here having the exact same rounds per minute of 324, Graviton Lance appears to shoot ever so slightly slower out of the burst. 324 to my understanding defines the in-burst rate of fire, whereas the time between the burst isn't really calculated or given to us on paper. As you'll see, by the time Corrasion has stopped firing, and it has 22 bullets in a magazine, Graviton Lance still fires an extra 5 bursts, which is another 10 bullets, and it has 30 in total, which means that by the time Corrasion has fired 22, Graviton Lance has only fired 20. You'll also see that the recoil is virtually non-existent in Aish'a's Care and Corrasion. There's a bit of kick within the burst, but it all centers back in the same spot more or less. Graviton Lance is way up in the air by the end of the 30 shots. This is very clearly a downside to Graviton Lance to offset its higher damage and the no drop-off range from that second shot. The aim down sight time is very similar across all 3 pulse rifles. Graviton Lance has the quickest of 0.27 seconds, followed by Corrasion of 0.33 seconds and Aish'a's Care of 0.35 seconds. Overall, not a massive difference, but Graviton Lance definitely has the edge. Lastly, we have the reload speed, which is slightly different from the previous 3 videos. This time round, we have 2 distinct times. The first being the time until the number changes for the magazine, and the second is the time until the animation finishes. As you can see, Aish'a's care is actually the quickest, with 1.07 seconds until the mag is updated and 1.68 seconds until the animation stops, followed then by Graviton Lance with 1.33 seconds and 2.13 seconds, and then Corrasion is actually the slowest with 1.62 seconds until the mag is refilled and 2.62 until the animation finishes. It is important to note that the time until you can fire after the mag reloading is somewhere in between these 2 times, so I'd say roughly as 1.5 for Graviton Lance, but this is just for the sake of comparison. From the testing, we can see that Graviton Lance has some clear benefits over its legendary counterparts, with the damage being approximately 10% extra per burst, as well as the increased aim down sight speed, the reload speed being somewhere in between the 2 legendary weapons, but it also has the downsides of a slower reload, more recoil, and it does seem to shoot ever so slightly slower than the 2 legendary pulse rifles as well. So on paper, looking at Graviton Lance versus these other 2 legendary pulse rifles, purely on a firing a bullet basis, they are relatively close, but Graviton Lance does have the noticeable edge. Now, Cosmology is a perk we cannot disregard, as it does create that void projectile upon defeating an enemy, and that projectile does do a lot of damage and can defeat hordes of enemies if used properly. And these 2 legendary weapons obviously don't have that ability. However, Aish'a's Care is the one that I prefer out of the 2, as it does pair with the strand keyword thing, whatever they call it nowadays, in that you can get a kill with a strand weapon and it has a chance of spawning a threadling. And from my using of the weapon, it actually happens quite often, and it is actually so effective that I've sort of dubbed Aish'a's Care as Graviton Lance Light. Now, that isn't just the pulse rifle doing that, obviously, it's the whole strand system. However, it does pair very well, and I do think it's something that you have to keep in mind. I have always had a great time using Graviton Lance, and it certainly feels like it has the power of an exotic weapon. The kick of the second shot also, funnily enough, helps it feel like it's very powerful despite it actually being a downside, and it can definitely hold its own against its legendary weapon counterparts, which have only been added to the game within the previous few months. This is very much in contrast to Cold Heart, which seemed to be incapable of being distinguished from a legendary weapon even though it was the first exotic trace rifle, and for this reason I'm actually going to give Graviton Lance the first A slot on the tier list. I do still have to recommend using Aish'a's Care with the Strand subclass, however it is a Trials of Osiris weapon and it caused me much pain to earn it, so you don't have to. Let me know your opinion of Graviton Lance down in the comment section below. Perhaps you believe it was worth the S tier, or maybe you have some bizarre hatred and it belongs in D or the trash. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please consider leaving a like, maybe even subscribing, and I shall see you in the next one. Bye bye.